How Osama bin Laden controlled Al-Qaeda while in hiding. Osama bin Laden spent nearly a decade in hiding, cut off from the world, unable to meet commanders freely, unable to communicate instantly, and constantly hunted by the most powerful intelligence agencies on Earth. Yet during this period, Al-Qaeda did not collapse. Attacks continued, messages were released, loyalty largely held. This raises an important question. How did one man continue to control a global terrorist organization while living in isolation? The answer lies not in constant communication or operational micromanagement, but in how bin Laden redefined control itself. He did not lead Al-Qaeda the way a corporate CEO or military general would. Instead, he built a system where influence replaced command, ideology replaced instructions, and long-term alignment mattered more than day-to-day oversight. By the time bin Laden went fully underground, Al-Qaeda had already evolved beyond a centralized organization. It was no longer dependent on his physical presence. This was not accidental. Bin Laden understood early on that survival required decentralization. He intentionally shifted Al-Qaeda from a rigid hierarchy into a network of semi-independent affiliates that shared goals but operated autonomously. This structure allowed bin Laden to remain relevant without being operationally involved. Local commanders planned and executed attacks based on broad ideological guidance rather than direct orders. Bin Laden did not need to approve every action. He only needed to define the enemy, the justification, and the acceptable methods. Control, in this sense, became psychological rather than logistical. One of bin Laden's most effective tools was delayed authority. Communications were slow, sometimes taking months, but when messages did arrive, they carried immense weight. A single statement from bin Laden could legitimize an operation, elevate a leader's status, or settle internal disputes. His silence often mattered as much as his words. This scarcity of communication increased its value. Leaders waited, they speculated, they interpreted. In doing so, they internalized his ideology rather than relying on instructions. This made Al-Qaeda harder to dismantle because removing bin Laden physically did not immediately remove his influence. Another key method of control was selective endorsement. Bin Laden rarely issued direct operational commands, but he frequently commented on strategy, targets, and priorities. He praised successful attacks and criticized those he felt were poorly executed or politically damaging. These judgments shaped behavior across the organization. Importantly, bin Laden did not attempt to control everything. He accepted fragmentation as a cost of survival. Some affiliates drifted ideologically, others became more extreme or more local in focus. Bin Laden tolerated this as long as the core narrative remained intact: resistance against Western influence and symbolic attacks against high-profile targets. This tolerance reduced internal conflict. Leaders who felt trusted were less likely to rebel. Autonomy created loyalty. Rather than enforcing obedience through fear, bin Laden maintained allegiance through ideological legitimacy. Control also came from symbolism. Even in hiding, bin Laden carefully managed his image. Recorded messages, when released, were timed and worded strategically. He appeared calm, patient, and defiant. These messages reassured followers that he was alive, committed, and unbroken. He did not speak often, but when he did, it felt significant. This reinforced his status as a figurehead rather than a commander. Movements rally around symbols more easily than they obey orders. Bin Laden understood this distinction. Behind the scenes, bin Laden also influenced Al-Qaeda through internal correspondence. Letters recovered after his death show that he actively debated strategy, advised restraint in certain cases, and expressed concern about civilian casualties harming the group's image. While he could not enforce compliance, his opinions still shaped decision-making. This reveals an important nuance. Bin Laden's control weakened over time, but it did not disappear. He transitioned from leader to ideological anchor. His role was no longer to direct action, but to preserve identity. Another layer of control came through succession management. Bin Laden was careful about who had access to him and whose opinions mattered. By limiting access, he shaped internal power dynamics. Leaders competed for approval, even when that approval came months late. This created a form of indirect discipline. Those who wanted legitimacy aligned their actions with what they believed bin Laden would support. In effect, they governed themselves according to his perceived standards. Geography also played a role. By remaining physically distant, bin Laden reduced the risk of internal coups or manipulation. No leader could pressure him in person. No faction could dominate his attention. Distance preserved neutrality and authority. Ironically, isolation protected his leadership. Leaders often lose control when they are too present. Bin Laden avoided this by being unavailable. His absence prevented him from being entangled in operational failures or internal rivalries. However, this system had limits. Over time, Al-Qaeda affiliates became increasingly independent. Some groups acted in ways bin Laden disagreed with. Others pursued local agendas that diluted the global focus. Bin Laden attempted to correct this through letters and guidance, but enforcement was impossible. This gradual loss of control highlights a key truth. Bin Laden's influence depended on belief, not enforcement. As long as followers believed in his vision, he mattered. When priorities shifted, his authority faded. Still, the fact that Al-Qaeda remained functional for years without direct leadership demonstrates the effectiveness of his approach. He built a movement that could survive without him, even before his death. This was not accidental foresight, it was a response to pressure. Hiding forced bin Laden to relinquish control over details and focus on narrative. In doing so, he unintentionally future-proofed the organization. Understanding how bin Laden controlled Al-Qaeda while in hiding challenges common assumptions about leadership. It shows that influence does not require visibility, and authority does not require constant communication. Ideas, once deeply embedded, can govern behavior long after their source is removed. This is what made bin Laden dangerous even while isolated. He did not act, others acted in his name. And this is why dismantling such movements is so difficult. Killing leaders addresses the symbol, but not the system. Bin Laden's greatest strength in hiding was not secrecy, but the ability to make himself ideologically unnecessary while remaining symbolically irreplaceable. That paradox defined his final years. Hidden, silent, and increasingly disconnected, yet still shaping actions far beyond his reach.